UrbanTalk would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we record the podcast, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. We recognise and we celebrate our continuing connection to country, and we pay our respects to our elders past, present and emerging. Welcome to the UrbanTalk podcast, the show where we bring together communities, planners and developers, and fresh ideas to shape the cities that we all call home. UrbanTalk is about bridging the gap between the industry, professionals who build our neighbourhoods, and the communities that live within them. We're here to make conversations about urban planning and development transparent, accessible, and we hope exciting. In each episode, we'll unpack issues, challenges, and visions that shape our cities. I'm your host, Belinda Barnett. On today's episode, we'll be discussing who plans our cities, where the balance of power lies, and how to best approach the future planning and growth of cities. This is going to inevitably intersect with housing supply and affordability, the provision of transport and utilities, and government planning policy. In my view, there's a constant push and pull between developers, planners, communities, and government in the planning of our cities. As a planner, it often feels like we react to situations and we flex to government or political catch cries. Currently, as a nation, we're all trying to solve the housing crisis. We have a national accord which sets an aspirational housing target of 1.2 million homes over the next 5 years through to 2029, and that's an Australia-wide target. Responding to the national accord in New South Wales, we have a series of new housing policies that offer developers a 30% density bonus in return for affordable housing. We have a new housing development authority that's been set up and is all ready to go to look at new housing applications. And we have a state government planning pathway to fast-track approvals. No doubt, developers are lining up. They're ready to realise the bonuses in return for affordable housing. But amidst the frenzy, we have local councils taking the New South Wales government to court over the new housing policies. And we have communities that are being split into YIMBYs and NIMBYs. Planners are schooled to be collaborators. However, I keep asking myself, are these new housing policies born of collaboration? Is collaboration in city planning merely a pipe dream? And if it is, who is really planning our cities? So to help me answer this question, I am so delighted to be joined today by the former New South Wales Minister for Planning, Dr. Rob Stokes. Welcome, Rob.
Thanks, Belinda. What an intro. Wow.
Well, Rob, you have had an impressive career in government where at different times you've obviously served as the Minister for Planning and Public Spaces, but you've also served as Minister for Cities, for Education, for Infrastructure, Active Transport, Environment, Heritage and Transport and Roads. You've pretty much overseen all of the key portfolios. You're currently an industry professor in the School of Environmental Law at Macquarie University. You're the chair of both the Faith Housing Alliance and the Connect Macquarie Park Innovation District, as well as a member of the Federal Government's Urban Policy Forum Advisory Committee. You have a PhD in Environment and Planning Law, which is illustrative of your long relationship and passion for urban planning, the environment and public places. Indeed, you very proudly call yourself an urbanist. So you are absolutely the perfect guest to help me answer this question. But before we get started, I'm curious and would love you to share where your interest in urban planning first began for you.
Oh, definitely Lego. No, definitely Lego. But I was always, I was the youngest of quite a big family, and so I spent a long time in the car looking out the window with my parents, and I just developed a fascination for the built environment. Just I was observing things. A weird, probably my only skill is when I was very little, and my parents would I was bored in the car. My parents would give me a street directory, just say, read that. And so I found myself as planning minister in the car saying, you turn left here on Ethel Street. And people were like, I was in somewhere, completely different to but I just had memorised bits of the street directory from when I was 5 years old, which is a pretty sad indictment on my childhood, I suppose. But no, I had wonderful parents, a wonderful childhood. But I've always been interested in the built environment. I have a passion for beauty. I get angry when I see beautiful things destroyed needlessly, including trees or built environment, and always had a passion for planning. And as a baby lawyer, I remember really reflecting on, lawyers deal with trying to resolve conflicts. And I thought, where are the biggest conflicts going to be? Over my generation, it became clear to me that, well, we're going to have more and more people and we're not going to have any more land. So that's where the disputes and the challenges and the conflicts are going to be. So there was a sort of coalescence of all the things I was passionate about.
Fantastic. So I guess being the planning minister was really the pinnacle for you then.
No, the pinnacle's yet to come. The pinnacle's yet to come. No, once this planning minister was a low point. But no, it was an amazing opportunity. I think that's the best way to put it. Amazing opportunity to put the theoretical into practice and see what actually worked. And I've learned some powerful lessons that I'm happy to share with your listeners.
Oh, excellent. Well, the Minister for Planning's responsibilities, as you well know, are set out in the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act 1979. Essentially, the minister's responsible for setting policy and enabling planning legislation such as state environmental planning policies, the making of local environmental plans that rezone land, you appoint independent planning panels, determine state significant development applications, just to name a few of the things that you do. From looking at the legislation, you would think that the Minister for Planning in New South Wales plans our cities. Was that your lived experience?
No, it wasn't. No. Look, the Minister for Planning is effectively the Minister for Land Value.
Right.
Your power is to be able to apportion development rights that are held by the community. This is one of the fallacies that people don't often understand. When they buy a piece of land, everyone thinks, well, they're allowed to do whatever they want with it. No, when you buy a piece of land, you're allowed to do whatever you're allowed to do with it at the point you bought it. If you want to change those uses, some of those uses are going to be exempt, so you can change without asking anyone's permission. So they are as of right development entitlements. Some you can, if you comply with certain predetermined standards, you can go and do these things. But for a lot of things, if you want to change a use or significantly impact upon the needs that your block of land imposes on others to provide infrastructure to, for example, then you're going to have to ask permission. And who do you ask permission from? From the rest of the community. And I think that's often a missed point. And I think it's important for political representatives on behalf of the broader public to hold fast to the idea that rights to develop land that don't currently belong to a landowner belong to everybody. Right. And if we're going to give those away, then appropriately, the benefits of increasing land value should be shared between obviously the person who's taking the risk to develop the land, but also with the community that has to bear the consequences of what that development entails. And so I think the best way to describe the minister's role is you get to control land values. I think in terms of actual planning outcomes, the Minister for Transport has a much more influential role. Right. Because quite literally, you've heard the expression, someone grew up on the wrong side of the tracks. Well, the Transport Minister determines where the tracks goes. So, and once those tracks are down, ultimately that is probably one of the biggest indicators of where built environment consequences will follow.
Okay. So are you saying then that it should be the communities that plan our cities?
Well, this is a bit of a fight, and no one really sees it as the fight it is, because when you think about it, there are two types of people, I suppose: people who own land and everyone else. And of course, all of us are everyone else if we don't own the piece of land. So landowners and everyone else will have different interests. And of course, landowners themselves will have different interests depending on what they want to do with the land. Certainly, you mentioned the NIMBYs and the YIMBYs. NIMBYs obviously are landowners or occupants who have an interest in saying, well, we don't care about development, just provided it's nowhere near us. My experience is that most people are NIMBYs at some point in their life, including property developers, dare I say. The number of property developers who have quietly come to me, even during the time when I was planning minister, and said, oh, look, we want a great outcome in this community, but nearer to me, can you leave us alone? So I think we should own that and recognise we've all got different interests at different times. And my view is that we shouldn't apply pejorative terms to people we should look at the merits of what they have to say.
Yep.
Because sometimes NIMBYs have a good point. Not because they're saying, don't build in my backyard because I don't want it next to me,
No.
but sometimes you can't build in their backyard because of a constraint, whether it's flooding, whether it's heritage, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And so I think, and that's the role of the planner, to listen to everyone and then to determine it based on the merits of what they have to say. And there's a balance between the private owners and the public interest, and government is there to be the custodian of the public interest. And sometimes public interests and private interests correspond, but sometimes the public needs to stand up against what private owners want. And sometimes that's because private owners don't want anything to change, and sometimes it's because private owners want change that is unreasonable.
Yes.
So it's a mediation, and it's always going to be an element of a fight. And one of the things that I learned, don't shy away from a fight. I mean, ultimately, we don't like fights, but when you think about it, we deal with them every day of our lives. Particularly those who have children would understand what I mean when I say that. But there's nothing wrong with it. It's how you deal with it.
Yes.
And having conflicts is a hallmark of relationships, and that's fine. That's normal. It's how you resolve them. I think sometimes in planning policy, we try to create tools and instruments and policies and machines that will spit out an answer so that we don't have to have a conflict. And I've been in situations where I've seen the duty planner say, oh, look, I'd love to help you out, but, computer says no. That doesn't actually stop the fight. No. It actually builds up a well of resentment that will spill over at some point. My lived experience is you're better off leaning into it, creating rules and standards and, respectful relationships around those conflicts, but don't pretend that you've got different interests, and don't pretend that there's going to have to be sometimes a mediated or even an imposed outcome. And that's what I find interesting about the role of the Land and Environment Court. Often, I know a lot of people get stuck into the court because of it takes time and expensive. But at the end of the day, sometimes you need those arbitrated solutions where someone comes along and says, no, this is going to be the answer. And you might have an appeal process, but at the end of the day, there's some certainty for everybody. Because one of the worst things I've seen in planning practice is when there is uncertainty. The element of surprise is never a good thing in planning. No one likes a surprise in planning. And also, though, the element of uncertainty. When I give you an example, there was when I was planning minister, there was a coal mine proposed in the Southern Highlands. Now, it was clear to me that it was never going to get approved. Of course, I could not say that because the moment I did, I would bias the outcome and create legal risk. So it had to go through the process. But while it was going through the process, no one was doing anything.
Yes.
So no one was investing in anything. It's called planning blight. And my concern is we run the risk of doing the same thing in urban centres where we say, oh, well, this area is targeted for redevelopment at some point, when the market catches up. But because what happens in the meantime? What happens to those communities? What happens to people's feeling about the importance of their neighbourhood? What about the social services and the richness of community life? If it's got the sort of Damocles hanging over it, that can actually wreak huge negative consequences. So certainty, as far as possible, is an important thing to aim for in planning.
Do you feel, because it's certainly been my experience as a consulting planner that works in community consultation, I feel that some developers would rather just go straight to court rather than investing in community consultation.
Yes, yeah. And look, and this is the problem, and I used to get quite frustrated where I'd see a developer quite obviously gaming the system and then coming to me when it had, all fallen to, turned to custard. And it was like, well, if you'd actually engaged properly with community along the way, you wouldn't be here and I wouldn't have, and you wouldn't be putting me in the situation of trying to sort it out for you. I often got frustrated that the community concern and angst around development was often the legacy of poor development outcomes in the past.
Yeah.
And so it didn't really, it wasn't terribly productive at the time to say it, although I noticed Paul Scully's had the bravery to say this, and good on him, which is, the best advertisement for developers are developers doing a good job.
Exactly.
And if developers do a great job, and so, I would encourage the industry to hold yourselves to account, not just celebrating great development, but calling out bad development.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, when there's a bad development, that leaves a legacy of mistrust that ends up costing every applicant more in time and cost and lost opportunity.
Absolutely. So in your time as planning minister, what did you see as the strengths and weaknesses, I guess, of the New South Wales planning system?
I think let's start with the strengths because everyone else is focused on the weaknesses. I remember actually I encouraged the federal government at the time to set up a forum of planning ministers. And we all got together from around the country and I lamented, oh, well, I've got the worst planning system in the country. And the Victorians said, no, I've got the worst planning system. And then we all fought over it because all the development industries in the various states were all telling us we had the worst in the country. And then later I spoke to the UK planning minister who told me that he had the worst planning system in the world. So the first thing to say is you're never going to have a perfect planning system because you're never going to have people with perfect intentions who are using it. The planning system reflects the goodwill and the collaborative intent of the people who use it. And so often, users of the system will ask for certainty. They want certain outcomes, but if they don't want what they want, then they ask for flexibility and vice versa. So you're never going to start with a perfect system. I think the New South Wales system is very good when it comes to strategic planning. There's a nested hierarchy of plans, and I would encourage starting with the regional plans, and I'd encourage the New South Wales government to get on with endorsing and making the next regional plan for Sydney. I know that's about 18 months overdue, and it's really important to make them in a timely fashion because this nested hierarchy of plan, the idea is they're all updated at the same time or at the same time every 5 years on the basis of the same data sets. It seems that discipline is starting to fall apart, which will have long-term consequences. So I think strategic planning is done pretty well. What's done pretty badly is development assessment. And there's a whole range of reasons for that. It's not going to be fixed by simply rewriting the Planning Act. Rewriting the Planning Act and expecting the planning system to improve is a bit like replacing a dented panel on an old Datsun 180B. You're going to have a nice new panel on an old Datsun 180B. You got to do the rest of the vehicle. And what do I mean by the rest of the vehicle? Well, the Commonwealth Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, the Rural Fire Service Act, the Roads Act, the Local Government Act, the Heritage Act, the Coastal Management Act. The list goes on. So fixing one thing will just point out the flaws in the other things. And ultimately, we have a situation where we have too many rules and too many laws and not enough discretion. Part of the reason that we don't have discretion is because we have very strong probity standards in this state, a very strong independent commission against corruption, a very powerful public accounts sort of Auditor General. So we have very strong probity systems, which in one sense is fabulous, but it also means that everyone's too scared to make a decision. And we often have, we pride ourselves on having in Greater Sydney alone 6 universities in the top 1% in the world. I don't think any other city can claim that. We've got top universities, top planning courses. We need more of them. They're under threat. We have top architects. We have top infrastructure professionals, project managers, some of the most experienced project managers in the world, incredibly high building standards, all the rest of it, a strong, consistent national constructions code. Yet, despite all this skill and experience, we tell people, no, you shouldn't make a decision without a rule to back you up. And I think maybe you need a very, very strong rule book when you don't have very skilled practitioners. But arguably, and conversely, when you have skilled practitioners, you don't need to have as prescriptive a rule book. And I think there is a learned helplessness particularly among council planners, that they'll get in trouble if they make a decision. That's the real problem. I think it's one of culture. And that's made worse by the fact that every time we see a problem, we think, oh, quick, we need another rule or we need another code. People often lamented to me that you go out to the subdivisions of western suburbs of Sydney or the western suburbs of Melbourne or wherever it happens to be, and you've got little ticky-tacky boxes that all look the same. And why can't we do about that? Surely we need stronger rules to stop this happening. The reason it's happening is because the rules are too strong.
Yeah,
that's the problem.
The
So we need the flexibility to make the right decision, and that's going to be partial. And the reason for that is that no two blocks are the same. No two sites are the same. They're all developed at different times and in response to different concerns. And that's why I felt, and perhaps the thing I'm most frustrated that I didn't get to do, or at least I did do it and it was there for about a week or so before it was taken away, was the planning principles. Because my idea was you get the principles right. What are you seeking to do? You're aiming to try to achieve a system that promotes sustainable development. What are your key principles to do that? Once you've got the principles, then you don't need the rules so much. So the plan was get the principles out there and over time take the rules away and give people back the discretion to make good decisions in line with the principles. That's what they've done with the National Planning Policy Framework in the UK, and it worked. Okay. And it's been replicated now in Wales and Scotland and other jurisdictions. And I still think there is an amazing opportunity. I encourage the current government in New South Wales to look at it, because if we're going to try and cure the fact that we've got too many rules by introducing more rules, we're on a fool's errand.
When you're talking about, I guess, some planners having a fear of using their own discretion, particularly at a local government level, do you think this is why we're seeing pressure for more and more, I guess, pathways becoming state significant development, which in some ways doesn't seem to be the correct use of the state significant pathways, because not every single project is of state significance, but we seem to be using the state significant planning pathway for more and more types of projects, a la the new housing policy and sending those applications to the state government. There seems to be this big imbalance here.
I've observed this sort of wryly and, risk becoming Homer Simpson's dad sort of yelling at the television. But there was a famous urbanist called Lewis Mumford who once wrote, and I forget his exact words, but I paraphrase them, building more lanes on a freeway to relieve traffic congestion is a bit like an obese man loosening his belt to lose weight. It's just making the problem worse. And anyone who's done any sort of traffic management will know that if you put another exit on a freeway, you just add more congestion. So literally all these pathways are just creating more roads to nowhere because ultimately there's no more capacity at a state level. And in fact, the state planning bureaucracy isn't terribly large. It's under a huge amount of pressure. I understand that some councils actually have more development assessment planners than the state does.
Yes.
So the idea that, the state will take control doesn't actually mean it will get done. And I've noticed we love a good euphemism in planning. And I've noticed the latest iteration is the Housing Delivery Authority. I note that the Housing Delivery Authority doesn't actually have any powers to deliver any houses. All it effectively does is create a new on-ramp for more applications to enter into a choked system. So it sounds good to start with, but it doesn't mean that any applications will get delivered any faster. And even once those applications have been determined and hopefully approved, it doesn't mean they'll actually get built.
No.
So we're actually looking at the wrong thing. I'm not suggesting that having pathways is a bad thing, but we need all of the pathways to work efficiently.
That's right.
And if there's a choke in one road, fix it rather than put an off-road onto another road. And fixing it is difficult. The way that we tried to do it when we were in government was we called it the Public Spaces Legacy Fund, where we figured, well, hang on, we've got some money here that we want to invest into encouraging councils to do their job more efficiently, which was assessing development applications. And sticks don't work terribly well with council, because at the end of the day, all you can do is impose a planning administrator and take over their functions, which means the planning administrator's got exactly the same problems as the council had. So incentives work much better. The public spaces legacy fund was actually a big pot of money where we said to councils, we will give you money toward public space outcomes in your community. So that might be new parks, it might be new open spaces, it might be new library augmentation, all the sorts of things that your community's been crying out for years for, and you say you don't have the money to do. We'll give you those funds if you agree to meet certain agreed determination timeframes. And it worked. It was hugely successful. The problem, of course, was it cost money. And I think with the current budget situation, my understanding, I'm not close to these things anymore, but I understand the government doesn't have the money to invest in those sorts of capital programs. And so ultimately, you need to incentivise the councils to do their job. We do need to right-size our councils, and fundamentally one of the biggest things we can do is do local government reform to uncap rates. I mean, that would be, that's the answer, but it's politically very difficult because, of course, if we uncapped rates overnight, some councils would swim and others would sink, and the councils that sank would become a huge headache for state government. We're seeing at the moment councils sort of reactively changing their rates, but part of the reason for this, and I don't have a lot of sympathy for these councils, but I do have some, because the rates have been artificially capped and are subject to things outside their control. They're sort of like the frogs that are slowly boiled until they can't sustain it anymore. And I think that's where some of them are in the situation of. So if they had more flexibility and also more accountability for their financial performance, I think we'd get better results. Interestingly, too, look at how people are elected to local council. They're not elected on their basis of their capacity to deliver financial responsible outcomes, because their rates are capped. So whether they're Liberal, Labor, Green, Independent, all of them will promise, we'll stop inappropriate development. That's because they're not held to account on financial performance, because they're financially infantilised because of the rates cap. And if people looked at the Local Government Act, and I was never the local government minister, so I couldn't change this, but you don't realise when you look at actually the charter of local government and their objectives, I think it's section 8 and 9 of the Act from memory, not one single one of their objectives as a local government, their objects, relates to providing for the housing needs of their community. They don't provide housing because we don't actually ask them to. So some legislative change there might be in order too.
Yeah, particularly when we're trying to tackle a housing crisis together.
Yeah, and we all need to do it.
We all need to do it at every single level.
And the state and to the state Labor government's credit, they can't do it alone.
No.
In one sense, they're trying to do too much, and they're setting themselves up for failure because acting by themselves, they simply don't have access to all of the levers they need to do what they're quite laudably seeking to do.
Let's talk a little bit about the development sector. So they've got some fairly powerful advocacy groups, the Property Council, the Urban Development Institute of Australia, the Urban Task Force. Do you think that private developers have too much power and influence in plan making?
No, they only have the power and influence that government gives them. However, what I learned is, as a planning minister, you can't act alone. You need all your colleagues to back you in, and you need to have a very, very strong backing. I was very lucky. I had premiers who backed me in, but there were colleagues who were always sort of thinking, we can, there's a good outcome for me for whatever reason to push a particular agenda. And look, let's face it, the nature of Sydney has always been, it's the gambling industry, it's the property industry, it's the mining industry. There are certain industries ever since colonisation and the invasion that have shaped this this city and this state. And it's not the same elsewhere, which is really interesting. When I've been to other jurisdictions, particularly in my post-ministerial career, I've been fascinated that the pressures I was under are quite Sydney specific.
Right.
So, but the one thing I would say with the development industry is my observation is I'd encourage them in their advocacy to stick to their different lanes. It seems that everyone's trying to sell the same messages when I think they've actually got the unique capacity to say things that are slightly different. So, for example, the Urban Task Force, well, they represent the interests of the property speculators and that side of the industry, and that they have a role. The Urban Development Institute represent the volume and particularly the suburban developers and the fringe developers, and they have a role. The Property Council represent the real estate investment trusts and the sort of big end of town, and they have a role. But I've noticed that maybe they're under targets to increase their membership, or I don't know why it works, but it seems to me that they run the risk of all saying the same thing, and as a result, the message can get confused where there are different messages. For example, from the property industry's perspective, I think a really important element of increasing housing supply is in creating an investment route for institutional capital and for the real estate investment trusts. I always observed that we never had problems in relation to building quality in the sectors that the people who own property long term are involved in, like commercial real estate or industrial real estate. And of course, people don't foul in their own nest. If you're a long term owner of a building, you're going to build it better. And so to encourage those institutional owners and investors into owning residential product will actually help solve building quality issues. And that's one of the things that keeps me awake at night, always did. Strata titling was an excellent system of owning a home in a 4-pack or a 6-pack or even a 12-unit red brick subdivision from the 70s. I think the Americans call them dingbacks. We call them 6-packs, but whatever they're called, if you've got a few owners and a modest building, then strata works well. But if you've got 500 or 1,000 owners, then an individual owner can be at huge risk of arbitrary increases in sinking funds or administrative fees. And my fear is the scale of these buildings is that, if a 6-pack falls apart and gets some concrete cancer, that's a problem for those owners. If a 40-story unit block or complex with 500 or 1,000 units starts to fall apart, that's a much bigger problem for society as a whole.
Yeah, I agree with you about the strata titling. So certainly needs much more investigation and communication to the communities who are looking to buy into these projects so that they understand what they are potentially up for. Yeah,
and it's interesting, like I noticed just tonight, I understand that North Sydney Council is going to have a big fight about increasing their rates. And I think their standard business rate, I think, is something like $750 a year, which sound very modest to me. Or no, their residential rate, sorry, it's $750, which seemed very modest. And I observed that, gosh, many of the sinking funds and strata levies, many of the strata levies, sinking and admin funds of unit complexes in North Sydney would be $3,000 or $4,000 a quarter.
Yeah.
And if there's a big public outcry about increasing rates, there's a democratic process that people can be invested in. Increasing those massive strata levies, there's no one to hear you scream.
No, exactly.
And I think that that's going to be a massive issue, particularly as the people who are increasingly investing in these apartments are an older generation who may not have a powerful voice when these buildings start to need repair in 10 and 20 years' time.
But even also for young investors, young owner-occupiers who are buying in, who are stretched financially, they're just flat out making their mortgage. So then to have to, suddenly come up with additional money on top of that.
Yeah, that's the point.
Yeah.
Actually, I stand corrected. It's not just older, it's everybody.
Yeah.
I just made the point about older people because as people get older, they often start to, no one listens to them anymore. But the same is true of younger people who have, often the exquisite irony of often when people buy their first property is when their expenses start to go through the window because of kids and because of all the other bits and pieces and that no one tells you about before you embark on the journey.
One of the, when we're getting ready for this podcast, one of the very sobering, I think, statements you made to me when we were talking was that you said that developers would need a density bonus if we got our city planning right.
Yeah.
I think that's just such a powerful statement. So what did can you just explain, just for listeners, a little bit more about what you meant by making that statement? Because,
well, okay, you go to a planning process in the Nordics. I know we always point to the Nordics as the fount of all wisdom, but here in planning
and beauty,
and beauty. but you go to a planning process in the Nordics, and the community get together. They determine the constraints and opportunities for development in a particular area, and they look at open space, they look at utilities, they look at traffic capacity, they look at all those sorts of things that a planning process look at. They then determine what the overall capacity in terms of development uplift there might be over the period of the plan, and then they apportion those rights generally in a transect sort of fashion, more in the centre, and it spreads out and gets a lower yield the further you go from transport, for example. And everyone agrees it. It's a very collaborative process, quite detailed. And once everyone goes away, they go and build what they're allowed to. In Australia, it's a little bit different. You go through that process. A lot of money is invested by communities and councils in doing the planning process. You determine those outcomes, and then the moment everyone walks out, like Oliver Twist, someone turns around and says, "Please, sir, I'd like some more." And people see the end of the planning process as the start of the bidding, not the end of the process.
Yeah, you're so true.
And that's the problem, because what happens then is councils go into these processes either consciously or subconsciously not in good faith. Now, that sounds terrible for me to say it, but I think if you spoke to council planners quietly behind closed doors, they'd tell you when they're putting out their plans and their yields, they will leave a buffer because they know that people are going to come back and ask for more. So they'll never put on the table the true reality of what the maximum appropriate outcome based on constraints and capacities actually is. So they're not honest going into the process, to put it bluntly, because the landowners and the applicants aren't honest with what they get at the end of the process. So what we have is a situation where no one's collaborating in good faith.
Yeah.
Everyone is going in there with a modicum of dishonesty. Developers are going in asking for, not all, but some, asking for more than they think they should get.
Yeah.
And councils are going in asking for less than they think they can accommodate. And so you've set up a context for a fight because no one trusts anybody. And that's why we end up in the situation we're in.
Yeah, it's pretty damning.
It is. And the only way we fix it is to be honest with one another and and this is the tricky bit, to take the speculative gains out of the planning system. And this is down the dangerous sort of topic of betterment levies and those sorts of things. I constantly get frustrated with economists saying, "Oh, it's the planning system. It's all the planning system." What they, either through ignorance or malevolence against planners, I don't know what it is, don't seem to get is that actually planning is all about property values. And they would say, well, then planning should go and just let the market do what it will. But of course, there is no market in abstract because it requires investment in all of those other public services and public goods that create the context for private development. It requires schools, it requires hospitals, it requires footpaths. I mean, people don't actually look at it, but when you actually look at a map of Sydney, it's more than 12,000 square kilometres of plenty of land. About 40% of it is given away to, as I understand, transport uses, whether that's roads, rail corridors, whether it's nature strips, whether it's, so a huge part of our landmass is actually public land. And it's and so there is no sense that it is a purely private market. It never has been, and it never will be. So assuming that the private market can cure everything doesn't understand the nature of the city, and the nature of the city is they're public shared spaces. They exist because we all come together, and so of course there's a lot of private rights, but they only exist in the context of the public rights and public freedoms that allow for them.
So it makes it very difficult, doesn't it, when we get down to trying to have, I don't know, meaningful community engagement.
Yeah.
And I know you did your PhD, on looking at this and public participation in conflict resolution. So, and from your time as planning minister, where did you land with community engagement? What's meaningful community engagement? We've got people holding back, and government. We've got these trust issues. How do we overcome them when we're talking about and trying to get communities, I guess, talking meaningfully about new projects, whether that's about at a planning level, like a city planning level or a regional planning level, or even for a developer trying to undertake consultation for a site-specific project?
There's no silver bullet. I think the first thing, as with so many social challenges, is education. I think we are cursed by ignorance of how the planning system actually works. People are unaware of what is reasonable and feasible and deliverable. Urban communities change. It's the nature of cities. If you don't want anything to change, don't live in a city. So that's the first thing to comment. And if you look temporally at your community, you'd be startled by the changes over a lifetime. And people marvel at the changes in the past, but they fail to recognise, well, that's also a roadmap as to what your future is going to look like too. So recognise that change occurs. Planning is often seen as merely a spatial exercise, when actually it's much more a temporal exercise, because spaces change over time. That's the context in which things happen. So I think understanding that everything moves is important, and maps are not helpful from that perspective because they create a mental model that somehow it's all locked in. So move beyond the sort of the rigid maps. I think conceptualizing a city a bit as a river is probably a more helpful way to look at things or to imagine things, because when you think about it, if you try and dam a river and just say, no, we're going to stop it, we're going to stop development, well, you can dam a river for time, but ultimately you're going to create an issue where you're going to have to create a bigger and bigger dam and a higher wall, and it's going to cost more and more to manage and sustain. And ultimately, at some point, it's going to be completely overwhelmed and you're going to lose everything. So a better idea, if you're seeking to change the course of a flow, is to do that, is rather than stop the flow, change it to deliver the sorts of outcomes you would like to see. So rather than trying to stop things, shape them. If there is interest and investment in changing things in your community, see what you can do with that to get the sorts of outcomes that you would like to see. Often I saw communities stop a development and congratulate themselves when they stopped a particular outcome. And then I would look 3 or 4 years later when another application would come in, and they'd sometimes stop that one too. But ultimately they'd be overwhelmed by something that was actually far more opposed to their interests than if they'd gone with the first application in the first place. So work with the currents of change. That's my first advice. The second thing I come back to is stop thinking rules help you. They don't. They often make things worse. I've been involved in processes where the rules stop us from doing what everyone would like us to do. And it's interesting, and this might be a controversial thing to say, but everyone in Sydney seems to talk about how they would love to see, somewhere between 3 and 6 story development everywhere, that would be wonderful. That would be an urban nirvana, sort of, the Parisian model,
yes,
or those sorts of things. But when you look at how land values work, when you look at how land subdivision has worked historically, when you look at development costs and feasibility, when you look at regulatory standards, the one thing that no one can afford to deliver is 3 to 6 stories. Because automatically, just to start with, once you're at 3 stories, well, you need lifts, you need fire systems, you need all those sorts of things that require sunk costs that you need to amortise over more units. So we've sort of created a regulatory impediment to the very form of built environment we would most like to see.
Yes.
And so we need to look at cause and effect and get rid of the rules that are stopping us get the sorts of things we want to, but also recognise that, well, then you don't get the benefit of those rules either. And this comes into the management of risk, which is another challenge we have. We started with talking about fear to make decisions. That's not just planners. It's also applicants. It's also architects. It's also engineers. It's also any professional. I mean, as a lawyer, I can say it's all lawyers' problems, but a lot of it is actually the fault of lawyers. Lawyers are there to tell you what the risks are. They're not there to tell you to avoid them or to ignore. They're not there to tell you to ignore them or to increase your appetite for them. The nature of the built environment is buildings deteriorate, and I think someone famously said shit happens. And ultimately, provided people take on risks and make investments aware of what those risks are, and provided they're transparently declared, maybe, God forbid, and I was a planning minister who, increased impediments around building in flood zones, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't build homes in every flood zone. It just means that you need to be aware of the risks. And certainly if those risks are, to go to the extent of potentially costing human lives, well, then those risks are not worth it. But if it means you might need to shelter in place, or if it means that a car might get wet, or, there's a difference between, for example, a floodway and a flood storage area, and there's a difference between a maximum probable flood of 12 metres, which is clearly unsurvivable, and a maximum a probable flood of 1 metre, which might mean that insurance is expensive, but doesn't mean that you can't necessarily build there. These are some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves, because however we build and however we plan and however we shape our cities, they are going to create risks for us. I have just recovered from another bout of COVID, which I should say I'm recovered, but it hit me at the time that, gosh, we all thought that was over. It's now an ever-present reality of urban living. And so the need to isolate appropriately is something that we're going to have to build into the way we build our buildings. Do we really want people to be isolating in a bed sit with less than 30 square metres, for example, and no natural light or ventilation? I would argue that is completely inhuman. Yeah. And yet we seem to be forgetting the lessons. I think it was it George Friedrich Hegel, I said, who once said that, I think it was George Friedrich Hegel who once said the only thing we learn from history is we learn nothing from history. Yeah. And we keep seeing those mistakes repeated in the way we plan and build our cities.
I'm going to move on now. You wrote an article last year about why our cities need true representation, and it highlighted the fact that Australia doesn't really have government dedicated to governing our urban areas as unified areas. It's a great article. I'm going to quote from your article where you state, "Our government structures do not directly represent our cities. The key is to make city planning a democratic exercise involving everyone across the city, rather than dividing responsibilities in ways that obscure the larger vision. The biggest challenge facing city governance is not too much governance, but too little democracy." How can we make our cities more democratic?
The French sociologist Henri Lefebvre once called on that people should have the right to the city, but we've got no capacity to speak for the city in Sydney. Or indeed in Melbourne or Adelaide or most of our capital. Brisbane's the one exception. And, the planning system that some people point to as the most effective in the country is that in southeast Queensland. And, is it any wonder that there is a single unitary authority that speaks for urban planning outcomes for Greater Brisbane? We don't have that. That's what we tried to do with the Greater Sydney Commission. Ultimately, I think part of the reason it failed was it wasn't democratised, that the commissioners weren't elected. And of course, councils are going to speak on behalf of their ratepayers. In one sense, it's unreasonable to say councils should have a vision for the whole city because they're not elected by all the city. No. I mean, ultimately, councillors should represent their ratepayers. And often their ratepayers say, oh, yeah, we'd love more housing in Sydney, just not here, put it in the neighbouring council. And, of course, there's no one with the democratic mandate to speak for the city. State governments, in one sense, do. But, of course, we have situations where where a minister for a utility might for Sydney Water, for example, might represent a country electorate, just as one example. State governments are loath to hand over the power for planning democratically cities because the problem of most of our states is, in one sense, they're sort of city-states. The bulk of the population, the bulk of the production all occurs in those big urban conurbations. And so I think the states are worried that if they do set up democratic city governments, then there'll be no need for them. My answer to that is, if there's a better way to do it, let's do it better. We do have a massive governance deficit, and getting rid of levels of government doesn't actually answer the fundamental question. We tried it with council amalgamation. And in one sense, it achieved some benefits. In one sense, it created more distortions because it was ultimately unsuccessful. But that was just an attempt to make local government better by making it bigger. But it didn't actually ask the fundamental question of how they're governed, and if they're well governed, presumably they'd make their own decisions about how big they should be.
Have you seen this model done successfully overseas?
Yeah.
Pardon my ignorance.
Yeah, well, plenty of places. In fact, I think look, every city has a different context and different histories and those sorts of things. I mean, Singapore has a wonderful model, but I don't think the Singaporean system would work terribly well here. But it's worth considering that Singapore has an enviable lifestyle, great public spaces, great transport, great, everything works. And they've got roughly the same population as Sydney, whereas I mentioned earlier, Sydney has more than 12,000 square kilometres. They've got 720 square kilometres. Yeah. So you don't need a great deal of space. You just need good governance. London is not a bad model because they've still got their borough councils, but they've got a Greater London Authority that takes responsibility for citywide planning. They have other functions in relation to transport, but interestingly, for example, Transport for London, I think cost recovers almost 100% of their expenditure. In Sydney, Transport for New South Wales, for example, I think recovers about 20% of costs. So having a targeted and focused urban transport agency that's run by people who are democratically responsible to the citizens gets better commercial outcomes.
Excellent. That's certainly worth exploring, I think. I'd like to turn now to your new role, actually, as chair of the Faith Housing Alliance. in planning, we talk about greenfield and brownfield development. You are championing a new planning concept, which I love, that you call field to yard. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, thanks for the yeah. So as we've always talked about greenfield development and brownfield development and greyfield development, but it seems to me that we've sort of run out of all of those things. And planning in one sense is an exercise in dealing with scarcity. We find a new urban land resource and then use it up and then look for another. But the fields are now largely exploited, so we need to look at other urban lands, inner urban lands particularly, and the only ones that are left are the yards, the rail yards, the school yards, and the church yards. I say school yards advisedly. I'm not suggesting that we should turn our schools into housing, but we should be turning our schoolyards into areas that the community can play on weekends and public holidays, and that's something we did in government. Because they're incredible public spaces that the public has paid for. So rather than lock them up on weekends and holidays, they should be available to the community. Rail yards particularly, that's what the Transport Asset Holding Entity was all about, was identifying how we can use sort of vestigial transport lands, old workshops that are no longer required, old branch lines, all those sorts of things. There's a lot of radial land left over that is owned by transport entities and they don't quite know what to do with it. So looking at them with a development lens, because by nature they're located close to transport, so we should be using them particularly for social and affordable housing. But on that topic, what is more appropriate for social and affordable housing in particular than places of worship and churchyards or religious owned properties? Many of these areas were set aside many, many years ago, and they were located proximate for communities to travel to easily. And many of those communities have now moved farther afield. Ironically, in my observation, a lot of more religious people tend not to be quite as wealthy. And as a result, they tend not to be able to live close to where those places of worship are located because they're so convenient. And so, ironically, the very people who use these places have been priced out of them. And you see, many churches and mosques and synagogues and other places of worship being located on urban periphery, which leaves all these sort of sterilised sites, some of which have declining congregations or even no congregation, some of which have onerous maintenance requirements that clergy and those sorts of people are not trained in how to look after heritage buildings, and so we need to find new uses for them. And what better alignment with their original purpose than to use land that was used to support communities, to support the community needs today, which is increasingly social and affordable housing in those really well-located areas. And I'm not suggesting that you necessarily decant the place of worship. That can stay there too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And many of the services they provide, whether it's dementia care, whether it's Meals on Wheels, whether it's local childcare services, whether it's support services, whether it's soup kitchens, all those sorts of things are made available for the people who need them the most in the areas that are most convenient. It's a win-win-win.
Great.
And the irony is, again, our silly rules prevent it from happening. In most parts of Australia, and certainly in New South Wales, a great deal of places of worship are zoned as infrastructure, given an infrastructure zoning in which social and affordable housing is a prohibited land use. So you can't even put an application in for it. So these sorts of unnecessary interventions and obstacles are getting in the way of great social outcomes, and that's why I'm investing my time with Faith Housing Australia. And it's wonderful to be able to represent people who are well motivated, who are kind, who are compassionate, and want to make a difference to some of the people who find themselves in positions of great vulnerability.
Oh, it's an excellent idea. I mean, it just makes perfect sense to be, I guess, putting social housing and community housing, in those locations. It's a ready-made, it's got a great social framework already in place. It's a nurturing environment for the most vulnerables. Sometimes you've got childcare centres operating there as well. Like, I don't know, it seems to make make perfect sense.
Yeah, and well, thank you, because we're getting quite a bit of traction, but
Good.
certainly any support your listeners can provide. Some members include great people like Mission Australia, like Anglicare, like Vinnie's Housing, like the Muslim Women's Association, like Jewish House. So who are doing great things in their community, using their land and their human resources to meet human need. And ultimately, one of the things that is most important in our cities, dare I say even more important than housing, because it's fundamental to housing, is that social contract. The idea that we all benefit from looking after one another.
Yeah.
And if someone in this city doesn't have a safe place to live, that diminishes all of us. It's all of our responsibility.
Yeah.
So to be able to support those people whose focus it is to look after those people is an enormous privilege.
So is there one particular state that you're getting more traction with than others?
New South Wales is the premier state. So
fantastic.
Kudos to government. They are listening to us.
Wales.
But we're getting a lot of interest in other states as well. I think part of the reason is New South Wales is also where the problem is most acute. And so it's where the problem emerged first. And your listeners may have heard of the celebrated case of Faith Hope housing in Marrickville, where there was an old Churches of Christ that was about 150 metres from the train station. It closed down about 30 years before. It was assessed by council's own heritage advisor as I think the 32nd best example of ecclesiastical architecture in the inner west. I think there are 34 examples. So in other words, it was the third worst. But notwithstanding, and I thought this was sort of ironic, it was the Greens councillors who tried to prevent the redevelopment of this church into 55 affordable housing dwellings on the basis of its heritage significance, which I thought was odd, because my impression of Greens councils had been that they tended to be more opposed to the interests of the churches and tend to be more supportive of the idea of social affordable housing. So it struck me as quite ironic that here they were arguing the reverse. But fortunately, but at huge cost to the church involved, those objections were overcome. And we now have, I think it's 55 affordable housing dwellings for families in a beautiful location, designed by Nightingale out of Melbourne.
Yeah, fantastic organisation.
Highest levels of design and sustainability, a really good outcome.
Oh, well, thank you, Rob. I'm going to bring the our podcast to a close. It's been so great to be able to have your insights and time today. I really appreciate it. It's certainly, I guess, reinforced that the complexity of what we're dealing with when we're dealing with a city, planning for our cities. I still think your comment about density bonuses wouldn't be required if our city planning was right in the first place. I think that's just a really powerful statement for me. That I think will resonate for a long time.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
We'll get there. We will get there. And I hopefully that we can get a bipartisan approach to exploring some new governance bodies and new approaches to actually, I guess, planning our cities along the lines that you're talking about, with more democratic planning authority.
Belinda, thank you to you too, because the leadership you're showing in having these conversations is really important, because a number of planners I've spoken to are quite lonely and discouraged. Their work is hard. They're dealing every day with conflict between community, between owners. Sometimes people are completely unreasonable, and that can be hard and debilitating. So being able to be encouraged by you, by talking about these sorts of things, is really important for them, but it's also important for society at large, because these conversations really matter to creating a just, a fair and a beautiful city.
Thank you. I really appreciate your comments, Rob. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Urban Talk podcast. Leaving a review helps others find the podcast, and don't forget to click follow for future episodes. If you have a question or would like to share your perspective, get in touch using the links in the show notes. If you're a developer looking to have an online presence or need help with community engagement, then get in touch via urbantalk.com.au. I'm Belinda Barnett, and thank you for listening to the Urban Talk podcast.